Hi everyone, welcome to DocuSpace episode 8, and that's the concept. This is the last episode of our season, and we wanted to thank our lovely viewers and our guests for joining us throughout. And for the last time, for now, I'm your host, Robbie.
And I'm your host, Joseph. And we'll leave it to our lovely guests to give a little intro of themselves. Ami can start.
Hi, I'm Ami.
Hello.
Anna.
And hi, I'm Jack.
Nice. You know, it's funny, no matter how often we do that part, that's always the the hardest part. It sounds like, okay, who's gonna go first? Yeah.
I think Banu should introduce herself because I did speak over her. So you can
Oh, Banu,
cut
do you mind?
Hello.
Oh, we said
my
your name a
is
ton of times.
Banu.
Again.
Yeah. Now Joseph spoke over her. Oh, Joseph,
Oh,
shush.
this is
Okay,
great.
go again, Banu.
Hello, Banu here.
I was really holding my laugh
Go
for
with
that
the
one.
original.
Right. And, you know, this feels like it's the first episode, not the last one, but that's maybe that's poetic in some way. But yeah, so the story or the concept of the episode is going to be about storytelling. So what's the concept? We're going to be talking about all the things that are integral about storytelling, why it's a very human thing to tell stories, but we'll never stop telling stories, and how that actually ties into what we do as architects and designers. Is, you know, storytelling is a really huge part of what we do. And you know, some of that is about our own stories and how it influences how we see design in the world. And then other parts is about like capturing the stories of the people we're designing for, the communities, maybe things historically or culturally. So we're all going to start by sharing a little story. Hopefully everybody's ready for that. I'll buy everybody some time by sharing mine first. So this story is actually quite recent, and it is tied to the podcast, which is kind of funny. So as you guys will probably see on our Instagram at some point, Robbie and I had this idea to like actually do like these little leaflet flyers. I wish I had some with me right now. Where we'd like, you know, because I was traveling a lot during, I think, the last month or so. So it'd be cool. Like every city I go to, I can like pass out leaflets to people and like have like some kind of like, you know, interpersonal connection about like inviting people to come watch the podcast. So we had like these little QR codes with like the Spotify and the YouTube. So anyways, besides the story. So this one happens while I was in Cambridge and I came here to like, you know, do some stuff for grad school. And I was like, well, I have some time in the day, so I'm gonna walk around, see the campus, and also like pass it out to interesting strangers. So I spotted this one dude. It was just me and him, like in the entire area, and he was like quite far. And I was like, okay, well, I'll go catch up to him and say hi and give him the flyer. And then he walks up to a security car and he starts like doing like some random dance with his arms, and then he starts like doing a humping motion at the car. And I was like, oh, okay, well, that's interesting. Maybe his friend's in the car. So I catch up to the car. No one's in the car. And it's a security van of some sort too. So I was like, oh, maybe it's like a law enforcement haha thing. So we're walking in the same direction, and he is headed towards Whole Foods. And I'm like, okay, great, I'll give him in there, and then maybe I'll talk to other people in there. So I lose him in the crowd for a little bit, and I spot him like by the beverages, and he grabs a beverage, and then I'm like right on his tail. I'm about to like tap him on his shoulder, and then he starts bolting, like he books it, right? And he's going towards the exit. I'm like, oh my gosh, he's stealing the drink. And then from behind me, another person starts chasing him. And so it's like a two-man chase. I'm like, well, I got to see how this ends. So I also start following them as well. And by the time we make it outside the store, he's like gone. He's just stepped on it. And I'm talking to the employer, and I was like, wow, that's awful. Like, does that happen often? He's like, yeah, it happens all the time, but you know, it's not a big deal. And we're just watching this dude like running like it's the Olympics or something. So then I turned to him and we have a little bit of small talk. And I was like, well, I was going to give him this flyer, but since you're here, do you want to watch our podcast? He's like, yeah, sure, why not? And so yeah, that was like a little misdirection story where I followed this dude and found someone else out of it. Yeah, so that was kind of like the highlight of that experience for me. And I will pass the baton to Robbie. Robbie, you're gonna give our guest more time.
All right. What I was gonna say to that is like it seems like you're a very goal-oriented person here because I would have given up following that person after I saw them being weird at the car. I would have just been like,
if you're being honest, I was being weird too. I was literally following a stranger. That's fine.
I was be like, do I want my audience to
to be this
do I
person.
want him as an audience? Like, do I want my target audience to include?
Hey, it's everybody's space, right? That's
All
the
inclusive.
my space.
I get it.
Um, So my story is actually a dream of mine. I have some very, very weird dreams, and I've shared some of them with people. Um, but in this one, so I come from a culture where they marry women earlier in their lives. And then they also, some of them are arranged marriages. And that's one of my biggest fears since I was growing up to be trapped in that system. So I remember this dream very vividly where I was running away from my own wedding on a tiger, a giant tiger. And I was like all dressed up and I was just like chilling on the tiger. And the tiger stopped with a traffic light and there were cars all around us. And that was a very empowering dream to me.
That says a lot about Robbie, actually, because I feel like you're very by the book sometimes. So she's like, even in her own dreams, she's gonna follow traffic laws.
I I didn't. The tiger I was on did, and it was just like,
Of course.
and I just started to attach a lot of, well, I have always attached a lot of value to my dreams and like what I see in them, and I like to paint them. So I used to paint goats from my dreams, but then since that incident, I've also started painting tigers from that dream. And then I found out that I was born in the year of the tiger, if that's a thing, which was also really cool. So I'm like, maybe that's something. Yeah.
I like that in your dream that you're having this rebellious moment,
yeah.
but you still have a very fundamental respect for the law, traffic rules, and when you're running away on your giant tiger, you still must obey the traffic signals.
Exactly. Traffic,
Do you think
safety first.
the tiger was female or male?
It was a female tiger. He was helping me leave the patriarchy behind. Yeah. And then, you know what? I think I was like not on good terms with this one friend. And then in my dream, I saw the friend interact with a tiger. And then the next day I was like, oh, I like this friend now. Like my tiger liked her, so I like her.
Dad.
Like that's how I squashed the beef.
Tiger approves.
Banu looks like she has a good story in her mind.
Yeah.
What?
I feel
look
like a high school teacher, just calling on people to read.
And the teachers would actually expose the most talkative one as well. They're like,
Yeah.
oh, if you're enjoying it so much, why don't we hear from your side?
I'm made for this. Look at me.
I can see there's a story from high school coming out here, being the chatty one.
Yeah.
The story I thought of had more with architecture, to be honest, because I was thinking about the second question as well, like how it would affect the way we design. My story is from 2 years ago. For my fourth year project, I went to Istanbul for the first time, and my first project in my home country, in my hometown, but it was focused around a refugee group, a migrant group that I had no idea about, Syrian migrants in Turkey. And I traveled within the same city, 60 kilometers from where I live, which would still be in the same city, but it's a district 60 kilometers from my house, and it felt like a completely different world. And I brought my parents there one time too, one by one, and they felt like they went abroad. Like it was that sort of difference. On my way there, I remember seeing like kids, Syrian kids, and if I hadn't been there, I wouldn't have known that. I realized that they speak Arabic fluently with their parents, but they don't know how to read or write. And when they start speaking Turkish, they're like, oh, they're so relieved, because Arabic feels like a extra effort for them to keep talking to parents. And this is especially the case with kids who was born and raised in Turkey, which is a bigger majority than I thought it was. And none of them know how to read or write their mother tongue, which was really powerful for me. Like it opened up a completely different chapter in my project where I realized this is a 1 year long project, but the way I see it, the cultural assimilation that's happening in their generation, like the 10-year-old kids, the 13-year-old kids, it's gonna have a lifetime, maybe generational impact on the way they live. Even if they do, or even if their families do decide to go back to Syria, which is probably not the case, the Arabic language will be gone. It will be diminished soon. Yeah.
That's wow.
It's a bit heavy, sorry. That's the
No,
first.
No, I think that's like actually a
amazing.
really, really good segue to what like the rest of the conversation probably be about. Wow,
Mm.
that's quite an experience. I feel like really does like open your mind to like, you know, these different nuances and things. So yeah,
Definitely.
thanks for sharing that.
Yeah. Another nuance is that I observed all of this as a Turkish like female on the
Yeah.
street. So most questions I asked them, they would, like they would be faced these questions from a Turkish person with a
Mm.
Turkish passport, and they weren't sure about where I'm coming from with these questions, whether I'm a government official or I'm just doing my own research. So whenever I asked like adults whether they are considering to go back to Syria, they would always say yes. But I would know that that's not true. Like among themselves, they would be like, no, not anytime soon, that's not the long-term
Right.
plan. But whenever I ask them, because the hosting population, which I'm part of, don't want them in the country, whenever someone from that hosting community asks them like, would you like to go back to Syria? They think that I have a certain expectation for them to go back to, so they say yes, we're going back. Then I see their kids, not even able to read or write Arabic, so there's a whole world of nuances and clashes happening there. Yeah.
All right, we're gonna hop over to Jack.
Yeah, but we'll circle back to that.
Of
Yeah.
course. I have so much stuff to ask about that, but we have 2 more stories to get through.
So in complete contrast to Joseph's story, which was last week, I'm gonna jump back to me at the age of definitely less than 5, because I remember I moved house. My family moved house from a farmhousey type thing to something in a village around the age of 5. And a particularly formative story, a kid's story that I was definitely given in a number of formats when I was young was Jack and the Beanstalk, because my name's Jack. And actually, just of the 4 of you, do I need to explain the storyline of Jack and the Beanstalk?
We know Jack and the
Because
Beanstalk.
everyone knows Jack and the Beanstalk.
I don't know.
Okay,
Like a
quick summary.
2-sentence synopsis.
Jack is from a poor family. He's given some money to buy some groceries or something. Instead, he spends the money on magic beans, which his parents aren't too happy about, but he plants the beans, they grow a beanstalk, and he climbs to a magical castle in the clouds, which unfortunately is occupied by a jack-eating giant, but it's also home to a golden egg, which is very valuable, and Jack manages to thieve the golden egg and make his family some profit, I guess. But
Nice.
this is a very funny story, and this resonates hard with me because I have a very strong memory from being in the garden at that house, and my parents were having a barbecue, and for some reason I was putting some grass on the barbecue. I was just toddler running around, handful of grass, put that on the barbecue, and I think my mum was having a bit of a laugh, and she then gave me some runner beans that she'd already cooked elsewhere. And she's like, oh, your grass was cooked and now you can eat it. And it's a runner bean. And I was obviously only young, and this is magical. Nature is magical. And I ran over to like the hedge where a neighbor was like doing some gardening or something. And I told them, I just cooked some grass and it turned into these runner beans. Would you like to try? And she obviously played along, and it was all very funny. But I think it's just like stuck with me that the marvel that came with like what we can do with something that's grown, agriculture, and I don't know, that element of magic from the Jack and the Beanstalk story coming through into my childhood memory.
That was so wholesome.
So precious. 5-year-old baby Jack. Oh my God. Okay. Okay, we're looking at you, Ami.
Yeah. So the past few years, for some reason, I always somehow form a friendship with a really old person in public, and it's always an older woman who either like, and this happened several times, like more than 2 times, so 3 times, which I think is way more often than like just circumstantial. So the first time I was on a bus from Ithaca to New York, and this woman was sitting across from me, and then she asked me like, can I sit next to you? And I was like, okay, sure. And then we just struck up a conversation. She was like 80 something, but she's lived in New York City her whole life, and she teaches ballet at Ithaca College, and she's been a professional ballet dancer for 40 years, and she's traveled the world. She's performed in Russia. She was like telling me all the, and it was just super, super incredible because somehow like she just, for some reason, we just like bonded and then exchanged emails and then like sent each other a bunch of emails and like photographs of sunsets because we bonded over sunsets. And just like the way she described her youth in New York City, she would squat in apartments with these artists, like this gang of artists. And it was the super bohemian lifestyle, like basically Rent, but in real life. And she talked about a lot about like HIV and AIDS and how that was a huge thing in their community at the time. And that was the first woman. And then in New York City, I was at an Indian grocery store, and I was looking for Maggie noodles, and this woman noticed me buying them, and she's like, "Oh, what are those?" And she looked so frail. She had a scarf around her head, so she was clearly either going through cancer or some other type of disease. She was moving around the store really slowly, and I convinced her that Maggie noodles are the best thing ever. And she bought a pack, and she had these huge bags of groceries from this Indian store. So I offered to carry her bags for her to the bus stop. And what I learned was that this is the first time she had left her house in 3 years, and that she was pretty sure she was going to pass away in the next few weeks. And she wanted all of her favorite, like, Indian food at home to eat before that happened. And she just had like this feeling like she was going to die. And I was helping her carry her super, super heavy bags. She had no one to help her. I don't know how she assumed she could just like do this by herself, because it took us almost 45 minutes to walk 2 blocks. That's how slow she was moving, because she was like, I've forgotten how to put one foot in front of the other. And she's just gonna take the bus home. And I was like, can I call you a car? Can I take you home somehow? And she's like, no, no, no. I've taken the 85 bus all my life. I worked for Vogue magazine. She is a fashion designer and editor. She's worked in fashion again for over 40, 50 years. And she's seen the whole city evolve. And we also exchanged email addresses, but that one was really rough for me to be like, okay, we keeping in touch, because a part of me just wanted to like keep the memory of her alive instead of like experience, like, I don't know, like you send an email and she never responds, and then it's like, oh, okay, so
Yeah.
I guess that happened. Um, and then the third old person friendship was in Chinatown. And this man was trying to cross the street, and he was too scared to step on the tarmac. So um, a woman and I were like, oh, can we help you? Can we help you cross the street? And he was super, super talkative. And he was talking about how he was searching for his son, but he couldn't find his son. But instead, like God gave him 2 daughters to help him cross the street, and it's just really, really sweet. And then we also all sort of exchanged phone numbers. The woman who helped him, and yeah, when we helped him cross the street. And it was just kind of crazy to me that these people who live in New York City that are of old age just live in such like in an environment we already as young people find so challenging. And just like he was scared to walk on the road, and New York is basically all road. So I don't know, it just really touched me that he was just out and about venturing, and his son was, I don't know if the son actually existed. I'm like suspicious because I don't think the son would ever abandon his father like that. But anyway, I somehow befriend old people. This happened again on our trip to Boston at a restaurant. I just attract them somehow. I haven't figured out an explanation, but they do have great and I guess in my daily life, I don't really get a chance to interact with them as much because I'm always surrounded by people my own age. But a small part of me wonders, like, if we have made more intentional effort to connect with people of older generations, and how we would benefit from their stories.
Yeah. I love the random acts of kindness that like spur all these interactions, even like as something as small as recommending someone noodles. And yeah, that's beautiful. I really hope that that like inspires people to follow your footsteps. Those are three really amazing. They all felt like movie plots, honestly, in my opinion.
And those noodles are great. Everyone should try them. I'm going home. I can get some for everybody, and we'll make it happen.
Yeah, I hope she enjoyed them.
No.
Yeah.
I have another story too that I actually like to share.
Go for it.
Please go for it. Yeah.
I
just
don't,
sharing stories the whole time.
Yeah.
I don't have a turn of encountering old people yet, but like you are, I love listening to their stories, and I think they around us it's really difficult to find people with 40, 50 years of experience. And for them, they live a much lonelier life than we do. Even when they have kids, they're not there 24/7. And their kids probably don't listen to their stories the way an outsider, a stranger would do. They wouldn't listen with such passion or interest, or they would already assume certain things about that story, saying, no, Dad, like you're getting confused. That wasn't this, this was that. So they would be more like frustrated with how old they're getting, but us as an outsider would be like mesmerized with all the details and the depth of knowledge and experience they've accumulated. With me, it was a bit of a different experience. I was waiting at a cafe for a printing store to open next door. So I had an absolute no rush, like half an hour just drinking my coffee slowly. Then I noticed this honeybee on the table next to me. It was an empty table. And I was really surprised by the honeybee because it's really difficult to find honeybees in London. And my dad, we do beekeeping as well. So I was like, oh, wow, like it's an actual honeybee. So I was staring at it. Then this really old guy came very slowly and sat next to me. So I told him, oh, sorry, like I was staring at your table because there was a honeybee on it. And he was like, oh, interesting. And then he sat down and he told me how he just came back from UCL hospital, which is nearby, near the cafe. And that he was just having his like round of checks, and that he had prostate cancer, and prostate cancer spreads across the spine, which is why he had a walking stick and stuff. But he didn't look more than 75 to me, but it turns out he was 86 on his own, heading to the hospital and coming back. And I asked him everything, like, how did you start working? Where did you used to work? And he told me back in his day, it was really hard to rent in London because it was expensive. And that's him talking about the 60s. I'm like, we're struggling to rent now. And even back then, he's saying he couldn't rent properly with a teacher's salary. So he went all the way to Nottingham and then like rented with friends there. And then at some point he said, I just started writing, but he was saying that as if he just stumbled upon writing, like with not a very clear direction or anything. And he was talking about it in a such humble way that I thought it was like a side thing that he was doing as a in addition to teaching. And after an hour of conversation about his many marriages and kids, and like how he became a father at 60, so he had a daughter at my age, which is crazy, and all those things. But once I had to get up, I asked him his name. That's when I asked him his name, just to be like supportive of his writing. That's me thinking I'm doing him a favor with asking what his name is. he tells me his name and he's like, yeah, you can find most of my novels in Waterstones or Foyles. Those are like Barnes and Noble type of bookstores in London. I'm like, okay, okay. Then he tells me, oh, this like blah blah blah. This novel, the last one, that's my favorite one that I wrote. So I would like, if you want to read any of them, I would recommend that one. I was like, oh, thank you, thank you. Then as I walk away, I Google his name, and he's written more than 100 novels, crime novels. Has done BBC radio shows and TV shows for 30, 40 years, and he has a Wikipedia page and all that stuff.
I'm waiting for that review, honestly.
I was humbled. I was like, I thought I was doing him a favor, you know, like support your local
Just so you know,
business.
quick little flex on you.
He must have been genuinely modest all the way through the story.
Really. He wouldn't have even told me his name if I hadn't asked him. And yeah, it was really nice.
And there's Joseph following people around in
I know.
public, trying to give
So
flyers
Joseph,
to
this is how
advertise.
you
You know,
This is how you do it.
just sit
you
down at
gotta
a
snake.
cafe, Joseph.
Oh, you know, actually, I think out of all of that, there's only maybe 2 people that have followed so far, and I haven't done a ton of it, but I could recognize them because apparently on YouTube, when someone subscribes to you, you can actually see the count sometimes, which is, I didn't know that, and I was like, oh, I remember this girl. So wherever you are, if you're watching this, thanks so much. Yeah. So with that, we'll get into the second phase of the episode. We're just talking about why these stories matter, and you know, like how it matters to us personally as people, and how it actually also affects how we see the world and design intrinsically, and also how like design can attach to your stories at home, right? Like, you know, your day-to-day lives and things that you experience, right? Things that you might share and think they're mundane or something that is a bit more like, I guess, grandiose to you. Yeah, so I guess I'll leave that conversation open now, whoever wants to.
Well, I can go. There's so many stories that have been told so much, or like certain groups of people, we haven't heard from them, and we need to start hearing from them. And as designers, I don't know how we begin to do that, but I think that's important, and maybe it has already begun to happen. Like, but yeah, that.
Someone mentioned that Romeo and Juliet has a version in many different cultures, and yet, I mean, I'd love to see some of the other cultural interpretations of it. I'd also like to see some interpretations of Jack and the Beanstalk from another cultural perspective.
Well, yeah. Puss in Boots did a retelling of Jack and the Beanstalk.
There
Did
you
you
go.
see that? They incorporated the character of Humpty Dumpty into Jack and the Beanstalk, and it was really interesting. I would not recommend it, but if you really want a retelling, you can go for it.
Actually, staying on the Beanstalk, and I didn't even forgotten about this when I decided to tell the Beanstalk story, but I worked on a design project. It was a competition. And again, it's in London, so multicultural society, where I think it's a fair assumption that quite a lot of people are familiar with what Jack and the Beanstalk is. And actually, the project was kind of a wayfinding thing in central London, with a design feature artwork that lifted off the ground. And we were really trying to incorporate something nature related into it as well. So we started almost calling it a beanstalk. And when this project went to kind of consultation, and sort of public presentations, that was part of the narrative. That was part of the story told behind this thing, which I think the project actually fizzled out in the end. But I think that narrative was valuable in creating something that people could relate to and feel like they understood, while wayfinding as a concept is maybe not the most like interesting or like necessarily non-architecture speak thing to explain to people. But if you describe it as a beanstalk, then well, we want to climb the beanstalk and get the golden egg.
True.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's work. London's a very multicultural place where I think there's quite a lot of people probably knew the beanstalk story.
Mm.
Yeah, I think the like in terms of design, especially like the aspect of the story is something that I feel like is great, but also like can be used as a tool to, you know, I guess like disseminate information in ways that distract you. I think like, and that's just like in general, like I think given the political climate in the US right now, like I think about like all the things that we are told versus what actually happens. And I think that's like the just the nature of the romanticization of stories. Like stories are so attractive, right? Like they're so powerful and they really move people. That it's really easy to get caught up in the story and then, you know, not really see how that story is being used. And I think part of this episode is like definitely trying to like investigate ways that we can actually meaningfully use stories, right? It's not just like the lip service of like I'm pretending to understand you, but actually like taking that story and learning something from it and then using that towards something else. I'm actually interested in Banu's story, where you were doing that research. Like how did you that story of like learning about the the disappearance of the language and assimilation, and also like the dichotomy between like you as the native, right, versus like the migrant, and like what that meant for you as like seeing that new perspective, in your project.
So I think I am a native to Turkey, but because my dad's Iranian, I've felt that loss of Farsi language and Arabic alphabets ever since I was little. And although like in Ghana, as you say, the native language was illegal, or like it's like they wanted to emphasize teaching English and English culture more than Ghanaian. In my case, my father had a huge emphasis on us learning English from the get-go instead of being fluent in Farsi and Farsi literature, which is so rich. And I remember ranting to my dad a couple of years ago saying, I know more about Shakespeare than I know about Sadi or like Hafiz, all these really famous poets. And it would have been an amazing opportunity for me to tap into Iranian cinema or literature with the mother tongue that I could have had. But to this day, he doesn't regret it. That I know more about Shakespeare than Hafiz. He's like, no, it's good. Because for him, gatekeeping that Farsi and pushing me towards English helped me shift my identity more towards Eastern Europe, Eastern culture. So I have that feeling of loss, which is probably another reason why I started to detect that in Syrian kids in Turkey more. They don't know, and they're not at an age that they realize this is a loss of culture. Their parents know. They can't tell that their kids don't know how to read or write in Arabic, but to them, they don't care that much either. They really emphasize the kids' assimilation into Turkey, way more than being able to adapt back to Syria, which is why they put more emphasis on Turkish and even English than Arabic. So yeah, I think there's like my personal experience plus my standing position in Turkey. They both, I think, influenced my way of seeing them as a researcher.
I agree.
I think that's a really common story I see with a lot of immigrant families. Like this emphasis on the Western being the the golden example of things. Like these literature or writers you mentioned, I've never heard of them like that. So that already tells you something a bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, but they're like equally important in the own right. And this happens in math and science a lot, where like there's a lot of erasure of like the other origins of these concepts and ideas, right? You don't learn about like the Indian or the Egyptian, or like you don't learn about those thinkers and creators as much, right? There's like sometimes there's even like a purposeful like omission where it's like, oh yeah, it was found by these people and this is the story of the world, right? It's always found by like people within this realm, but it just we don't really, like Robbie was kind of alluding to, give space for those other stories to be told.
Yeah. And then it's also about like overtelling certain stories, which was what Banu was getting. You know Shakespeare more than you would know others, like Dickens and all those, you know those more than others. And I have such a similar experience where my dad was also like, no, we need to know English. And yeah, no, I know English now to the point where I think in English. And sometimes I'm like, that's such a loss. But why was I like steered away from that in the first place? And a lot of that has to do with colonialism, right? It has to do with those things that had happened to us in the past that just make our parents somehow think that that's a better culture, or that's a culture we need to aspire to be. Um, but then at what point do we draw, like I feel like we as individuals can do a lot more in kind of empowering ourselves and educating ourselves about the stories that are lost, because if we don't hold on to them, like who is going to, you know? Yeah, it becomes
I have been thinking about this a lot because I'm home in India, and I noticed that when like not just my family, but anyone that I've had conversations with here, they'll switch to English if it's something really serious, but then they'll use their language if it's like just conversation. But if it's something really serious or something, like there's like a switch to English. And there are other signs of like Anglophilia. But what I did notice, it is a very specific attribute to our community of people who have aimed to be educated in the West. And we're like a really significant minority in terms of like our trajectories of like going and just like going to abroad for university and then settling in a country that isn't your country of origin, like the immigrant story to the West. Whereas like in India, like local life here is thriving and moving on without us. There is erosion and cultural erosion of in different ways, and culture is susceptible to like Disneyfication or Bollywoodification or whatever other types of pressures that create dominant storylines. But like storytelling is super resilient if you just know how, if you are lucky enough to be able to tap into that. And because my cousins have been born and brought up here and live here and work here and are going to live in the city forever, I have them to sort of take a peek into that world that I've been separated from for the sake of education, for all the other reasons. And that just makes me feel pretty optimistic. Like it seems dire from our perspective, but like though we're like such a small minority. In that Western centricism is a lot harder for us to evade versus people who just have like the ability to live and thrive in the countries that they're from. So I don't know. I don't feel so bad about it anymore. I used to be quite ashamed that I don't speak my mother tongue fluently, that I don't read and write in my mother tongue, that I especially like my Chinese or Korean friends at Cornell, they all speak their language. It's super important that they're brought up speaking that, but it wasn't quite the same in the way that I was brought up. And I asked my parents, and they're like, well, your adopted culture is your culture, and you can grow and experience other things in your life. And this is just like one phase of your life. And now as an adult, you can be more active about embracing your culture of origin. So I'm not so pessimistic.
Yeah, I think that's a really good thing to remember as well. But I think like the aspect of it that is very interesting to me is like I think what you drew a really clear line about is like this is something that exists outside, right? Like in the States, you know, this is in Ghana, this is in Pakistan, this is in Turkey. But then I think the the thing that is interesting to explore as well is like within the States, right? Like nobody's Native American, or very few people are Native American, right? Like the Native American is the minority, right? And within this entire migrant population, right? Like none of us are really natives here. It's interesting to see how like those stories develop and how they layered upon each other. And I think you're right, like in Disney and in movies and things like that, those stories are explored, right? Like it's not uncommon to see movies that are following in other cultures. I think that's something that is interesting is like who's telling those stories and how they're telling it and who's benefiting from those stories. At least like in my country, like it constantly feels like there's this stretch of like we need to become this thing, which kind of like isn't all consuming, but I think it happens enough that like I'm just curious, like, okay, like we're in this time where we have our independence, we have our freedom, we have our culture, we love our culture. but yet we still have this weird impulse to like mimic or imitate. Whereas like in the States, there really isn't that like weird insecurity about our own culture here, right? Like I think in the States, we're very proud of like what we do and like, you know, cowboy culture and like all these other things. And we celebrate other cultures too, but like there isn't ever this same feeling of like we need to become this or we need to like look like this, I guess. I just hope like I'm bringing clarity to that conversation in that aspect at least.
Yeah. So my roommates and I, to tell another story. So I'm from Pakistan and my roommates are from China. And this Saturday, last Saturday, we were all like we nicknamed it our small American family breakfast, but we were all just like making pancakes for breakfast and having them together and like sharing stories. And I was like, this is probably the most American experience I've had. And that was just really cute. Um, and what I mean by saying that is like following up on your point, like we don't try to be something we're not once we're here. Like we're very okay with who we are. And I think that's great. Drawing that distinction and that line is great. What the conversation also made me think about, and thank you for being optimistic about this, Ami, because I have not been.
Yeah.
is how like I wonder if like our storylines just diverge once we're here. Like it's like in a multiverse, and then when you come to a different place, you're part of a different story, and then it's okay if you can't re-enter the main story, or like you can, but it's okay if you diverge from it and then have your own story. So like Pakistanis back home are going to have a different story. Pakistani who are here for a little bit are going to have a different story. Pakistani immigrants are going to have a different story, and they're going to have their whole lives look different and have different stories to tell their children. And like, you know, those are the stories that we then as children grow up on. Also reminded me of Miss Marvel, what we just were talking about, because she's a Pakistani American girl. Like, this is talking about the Disneyfication of stories, right? And then I was watching that show and I was like, oh, I don't relate to any part of this. Like, you're showing me a Pakistani family. And why don't I then relate to this? But then it's also like, it's a Pakistani immigrant family who's been here for a while. So their stories are going to be different than my story. So it's okay if I don't relate to it in that way too. But really brings up the conversation of like, how do you tell these stories in like a way where people feel represented? I know a lot of Disney movies that are coming up now, people don't feel represented in them enough, and then Disney tries too hard, and we see it try too hard, and it becomes more complicated. Don't know where I'm going with this conversation, but yes.
But I guess the question I would ask is like, what's the point of representation? Like, just to be like a dumb question, like, why does that matter? And not like in the pride and tested, like, oh, it's good to feel seen and heard and blah blah blah. But like, what does that actually like mean and do, right? As outside of just making you feel good about yourself a little bit.
I mean, representation also like changes power dynamics. Like, I think a lesson that comes through from even just doing like architectural like visualizations and not putting, okay, you're doing I don't know, a lecture theatre and putting the white male at the front of the lecture theatre to an audience that puts the white male in a position of power. And by diversifying like your image or what your film or whatever, you can also like diversify that power dynamic, and that has wider kind of social implications. You know, of anyone viewing that, it changes the narrative from certain groups having authority or feeling superior or any of the sort of inherent things that society has already like incorporated. So it's like, as designers or visualizers, there's a bit of moral responsibility there to like fairly represent the community that you're illustrating or the audience that you're aiming to like address in a film or any other media.
I think even in design, I feel like we don't need more museums in the West to represent. Especially no more like white museums with like these artifacts looted and they're in glass showcases, and then, you know.
Yeah. A lot of shade.
Also because like I think we need more museums in the East, but not in the museum that we know as in the
Yeah,
West.
yeah.
But like you keep those objects still functional. They're not just things to look at, but they somehow keep serving the original function that they have, whether they are bound to be in a shrine or they're meant to be, used as an instrument, then let them be used as an instrument. Don't like declare it dead and then just like exhibit an autopsy of it, if that makes sense.
And I think in the architectural space too, like a really dumb example is like how the house typology works, right? Like, and the museum too, also like the idea of like how a museum works is like a singular thing, right? And I think there are explorations of like, what if a museum works this way? What if a museum works that way? I think those are the cool things that I kind of want to push about this idea of stories, right? Because stories can tell us how we live and what we care about and how we live. And I think for example, for the house situation, right? Like I took a class in Cornell where we're talking about how the modern American kitchen came to be, and this whole idea that was centered around like the role of the woman and the woman having control over that space, and then appliances being like a way of like showing class and status within the home, right? This idea of like the dinner party, you bring a guest over, you can show them the new model fridge or microwave you bought, right? Or the new car you got, right? And how all those things have evolved, and maybe the essence of them has been lost, but those like residues of them is what is, right? Like that's how the kitchen is set up in most places, right? Like design and the built environment is so intrinsically tied to the story of the people that came up with it or ideated it. And sometimes we think like it's inert, but that's kind of what we've been trying to emphasize over and over again, is like houses don't have to look like that. They look like that because of the specific lineage and the specific storytelling or the specific way that the people live, right? And that's not the default. So there can be other ways of building. There can be other ways of living. And those are the things that we're trying to express about like having that multiplicity of storytelling, right? Like having other stories be told as much. Because then it just benefits all of us in the end, right? It gives us different ways to see the world, and we don't have to limit ourselves to it is this way because that's the only way it can be. I think that's like the thing that I hate about architecture right now. It's like it has to be this way. No, it doesn't. Someone decided that for us, and we just keep on telling ourselves that because we've been doing it that way forever, and maybe it's not working anymore. We need to like actually push back and say, okay, we've done this for 20 years. It doesn't work. These are the reasons it doesn't work. What are the other alternatives? But we don't do that very often. And I guess that's my personal frustration with how like the architectural field is set up, where it's like there's this idea of like, well, that's how it's always been done, so that's how we're always going to do it. And I think it's not because the other alternatives don't exist. It's just the space for them isn't there. Like we just don't give space to them, right? So yeah, that's my little mini rant.
I think
I'm so glad you brought that up, because I think there could be actually a whole podcast series about storytelling and design of kitchens, like combined together, design and layout of kitchens. Because like you said, like in my house, for example, in Turkey, when my parents were getting it designed, they were getting it designed in the 2000s, and open kitchen was like fresh out and really trendy. So they had that one done. Then a couple years later, we got super uncomfortable because most of the cooking in Turkey is with onions. And of course, kitchen is in the ground floor. And because it's open house, all the armchairs in the living room started smelling like onions. The curtains, upper floors started smelling like onions. Like the moment my dad or my mom would cut onions, we would wake up upstairs because we would like breathe in the smell of onions. And then another aspect of it, we realized like Turkish culture and in general Middle Eastern culture, you're not that transparent with your guests in regards to what you do in the kitchen, because sometimes it gets messy while you cook, and most of the time the host don't want to show that to the guest. So in a couple years later, we got a sliding door between the kitchen and the living room done, and then we're like, okay, now we can comfortably cut our onions and then create a mess in the kitchen without letting the guests know that there's a mess.
And you could tell the guests, it's just to keep the smell contained.
Exactly.
I do think there's a difference between aesthetic and story, though. Like, I guess I'm having a hard time separating the two, but they are different. Like if you had houses that looked like Spanish colonial houses in California, that's an aesthetic, and it is sort of telling some kind of story, but it's not real. Like it's just an illusion of the actual like lived experiences in that area. I don't know, does that make sense? Like
No,
my
you're making
housing
perfect sense. Yeah.
community is based on California. Like we have palm tree-lined roads and terracotta tile roofs and like French doors, and we're in the middle of Bangalore in India, and it's like completely foreign to the context. But there's still like, but that's just the aesthetic. It doesn't mean like the lives within are any less Indian.
Yeah.
Mm.
So I guess like story and architecture for me now have very different places. Like I don't know how to reconcile that. I don't think architecture actually tells real narrative from the perspective that we're looking at. Like looking at the building, looking at the design, looking at the drawings. I don't think those things tell story, but like when you talk to people who live in those buildings, that's where when the story emerges. I don't know if anyone has thoughts about that.
Gee,
No, that's
well,
super cool because go ahead, Jack.
oh, thanks. While Joseph was saying about the Ghanaian kitchens, I was thinking. I think I mentioned in another the context podcast that I went to Ghana, Accra specifically, where there's a lot of
Oh,
very colonial like looking dwellings. It usually looks like a lot of central Accra looks like colonial architecture. But then we were invited into an architect's house. It was his house, and from the outside looked like a very colonial sort of building, but actually the inside was straight into like a courtyard, and all the rooms were off the courtyard. Very not like a kind of British layout, and actually they were using that as an extended cooking space. So aesthetically looked like a colonial narrative had been brought into Accra, but actually the people who were living inside that had made it their own in a way.
yeah, Jack, I was gonna say a similar thing to that. I think this idea of sharing stories, like, and maybe like I think Ami's right. Like the building is never gonna tell you anything, like a story, actually, right? Like it is just an object at the end of the day. But I think the cool thing that is infused about that story is like where that element of that language comes from. Because I think I was doing this reading where the veranda, like that archetype, was not like native to a lot of these tropical climates, right? Like this outdoor covered space was like from the portico, but then it actually made more sense there. And so it's become almost analogous to what that sort of building style is, but it didn't originate from there, right? And you can do that with agriculture, with art, with music, with clothes, right? Like the human story is not something that is like perfectly clean cut. There's always crossover and mixing, and that's historically always been the case, and it always will be the case. So I don't ever want to pretend to say like, oh, this is specifically this culture and it only can exist that way, or this is specifically this culture. I think that's like not productive thinking, honestly. And then what is interesting is like when those cases come up about, right, like it's like what is elevated in terms of those conversations. And I think in like what you're saying, like with the colonial architecture in Ghana, like actually still finding ways to not work in that way. I think those are like the cool things about it is like if there's agency for people to actually like enact the way they want to live, even if it looks this way, it lets me live this way, right? And I think that's like super cool. Like I love instances of that happening. And I think in the States, like that happens sometimes too. Like for example, in Florida, they do have these outdoor porches, but it's very common for them to actually have screens on these porches, so it becomes like a semi-enclosed space, and that's because of the mosquitoes there, or the insects, and it's like evolution that the people have enacted on that building themselves. And I guess in architecture, like I really want ways for where like we can actually start inviting people to do that more, where it's like you don't have to take the built environment as it's given to you, right? If you can enact it or do like little transformations and things like that, like I hope that people will do that more often. And of course, it gets to house value and real estate, blah, blah, blah. But like, like we don't all have to live in sad beach houses, right? Like you should have some ownership of your spaces a little bit. If you want to paint it that ugly color, do it, because maybe that looks good to you. And I think it was funny because in my office, our boss was like renovating his bathroom, And Gabriella, my coworker, was like, I really don't like that color, and I don't like this metal he used. But I was like, well, at least it tells you something about him, right? It's not just like the white palette of every bathroom, right? Like it's his self-expression. I don't know. I guess like that's something that I'm really passionate about, seeing people have that agency in, and I think DocuSpace, that's part of the thing that I want to impart with people. So I guess that's like my takeaway actually already. So
yeah, I was getting to that. I'm like, they've been here a while and they probably have stuff to do.
Round of takeaways. That was Joseph's.
um, okay. Well, my takeaway is kind of political given everything else that's going on in the world. Um, I think words have, and we all know that words have a lot of power. Um, and when it's your job to put words out there for everyone else to consume, it is your responsibility to do that in an honest way. And that's something we've not been encountering lately, given the news that we've been reading lately, where things have been miswritten, words have been toned down to mean something else, whereas something else is happening. And I just wish people would take more responsibility when they have the power. To tell stories the way they're supposed to be told. And at the end of the day, what Ami said, like stories are resilient. We as human beings are resilient, and these stories are going to come through no matter what. But as it's your responsibility as a storyteller, especially for people who are in those jobs, to tell it, to actually do that. So that's the message I'm putting out in the world, and I'm hoping someone listens to me.
Oh. Yes.
Love the quiet clapping. Oh Lord. Banu, the teacher's gonna pick on you again. Banu, do you care to share?
Yeah, my takeaway is somewhere along what Rabbi said as well. Like to make sure storytelling is inclusive and design is a way of storytelling. And like she said, we do have a responsibility to like keep voices heard. I think this podcast has been great. Like maybe something to wrap that up as well, knowing that this is the last episode.
Also the longest one too.
Oh, we don't want to go.
Subconsciously, maybe that's what we're doing.
We don't want this to end. I think I really appreciate you guys like reaching out and like inviting us to such a space so that we have our voices heard and we bounce off these ideas and feelings. So it has been great. So thank you so much.
Actually, yeah, in a similar tone, like my takeaway is that I feel like I've gained so much on listening to all four of your stories, and I think our listeners are in the right place, because my takeaway would be to keep your ears out for these great stories. And I mean, I'm going to take away, I'm going to walk out of my house and I'm going to look at an elderly person or in a completely different way. I might start following them down the street until they tell me a really interesting
Giving
story.
flyers.
Or yeah. Clearly they've got a lot of story to give. So I've taken away from this experience something that I can appreciate, and I'll be looking out for. So thank you.
I mean, I don't know what to say. I'm super proud of you both. It's been really nice to see how this has evolved from a tiny seed of an idea into like a super well thought out, structured series of 8 episodes. And I feel like I enjoy talking to you all so much. It's just nice to have a dedicated space for conversation and storytelling. So yeah, that's such a gift. So thank you so much.
Yeah, and I want to thank you guys all for being here. Everybody who wasn't on this last episode, thank you for coming as well. Like these people have really made it really possible. Like you've moved your schedules, and there's been hard things about like can you meet here, can you meet there, and all that. And like that dedication has been very like felt, and we can't thank you enough, right? Like your time is precious, and we want to respect that as much as we can. So yeah, thank you for being here for the last episode. And
I
Ravi,
know.
yeah.
Oh my gosh, you guys make
Thank
me
you
so
for hosting us.
emotional. I don't know how to, I don't want to leave, but okay. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Like, subscribe, leave a comment. You guys please watch this stuff too. And with that, I don't know. I think I'm out of like goodbye lines. Does anyone want to say it?
This is not a goodbye. This is a till next time. So
This is a till next time.
Like that.
Bye bye.
thank you guys so much.
Thank you.